June 22, 1941. Along a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, the largest invasion force ever assembled in human history began to move. 3 million German soldiers, 3,000 aircraft, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 3,000 tanks rolled eastward into the Soviet Union. But imagine a different reality, a world where Germany faced Stalin alone, where every Panzer division, every Luftwaffe squadron, every Wehrmacht soldier that history scattered across North Africa, Western Europe, and the Mediterranean was instead concentrated on a single, colossal front. This is the story of how Operation Barbarossa could have unfolded if Germany had fought only the Soviet Union in World War II. What would have happened when the full, undivided might of the Third Reich turned east? When no second front divided Hitler's attention? When the German war machine operated at absolute maximum capacity against a single enemy? The answer would reshape the entire course of the war. To understand this alternate reality, we must first grasp what actually happened in our timeline. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, he committed approximately 153 divisions to the Eastern Front, roughly 3 million men. But this represented only a portion of Germany's total military strength. In the real war, Wehrmacht forces were simultaneously deployed across multiple theaters. The Afrika Korps fought in North Africa. Luftwaffe squadrons defended the homeland against Allied bombing. Entire divisions garrisoned occupied Norway, Denmark, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. U-boats prowled the Atlantic, and as the war progressed, more and more German strength hemorrhaged into secondary campaigns. By 1943, Germany maintained 60 divisions in Western Europe alone, preparing for an inevitable Allied invasion. The Italian campaign consumed another 25 divisions. Anti-aircraft defenses across Germany employed over 1 million personnel and thousands of the deadly 88mm guns that could have been devastating anti-tank weapons on the Eastern Front. But in our alternate scenario, none of this exists. Pause. France never falls because Germany never attacks westward. Britain remains unthreatened, but also uninvolved. No Mediterranean theater divides German resources. No Atlantic wall consumes men and materiel. No strategic bombing campaign forces the Luftwaffe into defensive operations. There is only one enemy, the Soviet Union. And against that enemy, Germany can deploy everything. The strategic situation transforms completely. Instead of 153 divisions invading Russia, imagine 220 divisions, nearly 50% more combat power. Instead of 3,000 tanks, imagine 4,500 panzers crossing the border. Instead of 2,700 aircraft, imagine 4,000 Luftwaffe planes achieving air superiority. The German high command, freed from the nightmare of multi-front warfare, could focus all industrial production, all logistical planning, and all strategic thinking on a single objective: the destruction of the Soviet Union. On the Soviet side, Stalin's Red Army in June 1941 was a massive but deeply flawed fighting force. The purges of 1937–38 had decimated the officer corps. Training was inadequate, communications were primitive, and Soviet doctrine was in complete disarray, caught between outdated theories and incomplete modernization. The Red Army possessed numerical superiority in tanks and aircraft, but most were obsolete models. The new T-34 and KV-1 tanks were only beginning production. Soviet forces were poorly deployed, clustered in forward positions where they could be easily encircled. And the border fortifications, the Stalin Line, had been partially dismantled in favor of new positions that weren't yet complete. Against this vulnerable opponent, the enhanced German invasion force would have been absolutely devastating. In our timeline, Army Group Center, the strongest of 3 German army groups, struck toward Moscow with 50 divisions and 2 panzer groups. In this alternate scenario, Army Group Center would field 75 divisions and 3 full panzer groups. Every gap in the line that historically went unexploited due to insufficient reserves would now be filled with fresh divisions. Army Group North, driving toward Leningrad, would advance with 40 divisions instead of 29. The critical city of Leningrad, which endured a 872-day siege in actual history, would face complete encirclement by overwhelming force in a matter of weeks. Army Group South, tasked with capturing Ukraine and pushing toward the Caucasus oil fields, would operate with 70 divisions instead of 57, backed by an additional 15 Romanian and Hungarian divisions, whose combat effectiveness would be dramatically improved by superior German support and coordination. The initial German advance would have been even more catastrophic for the Soviets than the historical disaster that actually unfolded. Passant. In real history, the Wehrmacht advanced 300 miles in 3 weeks, encircling and destroying entire Soviet armies in massive pockets at Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev, and elsewhere. Over 600,000 Soviet soldiers were captured at Kiev alone, the largest encirclement in military history. By August 1941, when the German advance historically began to slow, the enhanced Wehrmacht would still be driving forward at full momentum. The critical delays that gave Moscow precious time to organize its defense would not occur. Every panzer division that historically sat idle due to fuel shortages or maintenance issues would be operational, supported by robust logistics freed from competing Western Front demands. The German advance would reach the outskirts of Moscow not in December 1941, as happened historically, but by late September or early October, a difference of 8 crucial weeks. And the forces arriving at Moscow's gates would be dramatically stronger, 85 divisions instead of 60, with 2,000 operational tanks instead of 1,000. Soviet casualties by this point would have been staggering beyond the already catastrophic historical losses. In actual history, the Red Army lost approximately 2.8 million men, killed, wounded, or captured, in the first 5 months of the war. In this alternate scenario, losses would exceed 4 million, with entire Soviet field armies ceasing to exist. The industrial evacuation that saved Soviet war production would face greater disruption. In real history, the Soviets evacuated over 1,500 factories eastward beyond the Urals, preserving their ability to produce tanks, aircraft, and ammunition. But with German forces advancing faster and deeper, more factories would be captured before evacuation. The critical tank production facilities at Kharkov and Leningrad would fall intact. Aircraft factories would be overrun. By October 1941, the situation facing the Soviet Union would represent an existential crisis beyond anything Stalin had imagined in his darkest nightmares. Moscow itself would be within artillery range. German forward reconnaissance units would reach the suburbs of the capital. The Kremlin, where Stalin coordinated the defense, would be under direct threat. In real history, Stalin briefly considered abandoning Moscow in mid-October 1941 before deciding to stay. In this scenario, that decision would be far more desperate. The defense of Moscow would face impossible odds. The hastily assembled militia units, the factory workers pressed into service, the inexperienced troops rushed from Siberia, all would face a German force nearly twice as strong as the historical attackers. The winter mud that historically slowed the German advance would still arrive in late October, but the Wehrmacht would already be positioned in Moscow's outer defensive perimeter. General Georgy Zhukov, the brilliant Soviet commander rushed to Moscow's defense, would work miracles with inadequate forces. But even Zhukov's tactical genius has limits. When facing 85 German divisions with perhaps 60 Soviet divisions of varying quality, all exhausted from constant retreat, the mathematics of warfare become brutally simple. The civilian population of Moscow, over 4 million people, would face catastrophic danger. Panic would grip the city. Government officials would evacuate. The NKVD would struggle to maintain order as rumors spread of German breakthrough. And yet the crisis goes deeper than Moscow alone. Leningrad in the north would fall completely in October 1941, ending the famous siege before it truly began. The city's population of 2.5 million would face occupation rather than starvation. The psychological blow to Soviet morale would be devastating. Leningrad, the birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution, in Nazi hands. In the south, German forces would have captured Rostov-on-Don and would be driving into the Caucasus region by November 1941, a full year ahead of the historical timeline. The oil fields at Maikop would be within reach. The vital supply route through the Caucasus to the Middle East, a route that would later bring American Lend-Lease aid, would be severed. Soviet industrial production would plummet. In real history, by December 1941, Soviet tank production had fallen to 40% of pre-war levels before recovering. In this scenario, it would fall to perhaps 20% and stay there. Aircraft production would collapse similarly. The ammunition factories around Moscow would be captured or destroyed. But here, in this moment of supreme crisis, the realities of warfare in Russia would begin to assert themselves. Because even a Wehrmacht 50% stronger than historical faces the same implacable enemies that defeated Napoleon: geography, weather, and distance. The Russian winter of 1941–42 would arrive with the same brutal force regardless of German strength. Temperatures would plummet to -40 degrees Celsius. German soldiers, still wearing summer uniforms because the supply system couldn't deliver winter clothing fast enough, would face frostbite and exposure. Tanks would refuse to start. Weapons would freeze. The wounded would die in unheated field hospitals. But here in this moment of supreme crisis, the realities of warfare in Russia would begin to assert themselves. Because even a Wehrmacht 50% stronger than historical faces the same implacable enemies that defeated Napoleon: geography, weather, and distance. The Russian winter of 1941–42 would arrive with the same brutal force regardless of German strength. Temperatures would plummet to -40 degrees Celsius. German soldiers, still wearing summer uniforms because the supply system couldn't deliver winter clothing fast enough, would face frostbite and exposure. Tanks would refuse to start. Weapons would freeze. The wounded would die in unheated field hospitals. Every German truck, every railway locomotive, every horse-drawn supply wagon would be operating beyond design capacity. The Soviet rail system used a different track gauge than European railways, forcing Germans to transship supplies, a bottleneck that couldn't be eliminated by having more combat troops. The primitive Russian road network would dissolve into bottomless mud, then freeze into ice. The enhanced Wehrmacht, for all its additional strength, would discover the same truth that doomed Napoleon's Grand Army in 1812. Russia is too vast, too harsh, and too unforgiving to conquer through military force alone without sustainable logistics. The final assault on Moscow, launched in late November 1941, would grind forward through snow and ice. German panzer spearheads would reach within 10 miles of the Kremlin. Artillery shells would fall on Red Square. The Soviet government would evacuate to Kuibyshev, 500 miles east, but the German advance would exhaust itself through sheer physical impossibility. Tanks would run out of fuel within sight of their objectives. Infantry divisions would become combat ineffective from casualties and frostbite. Artillery would fall silent as ammunition stocks depleted faster than resupply could occur. The Luftwaffe would be grounded by weather and lack of fuel. And then, in early December 1941, the remaining Siberian divisions, fewer than in real history, but still formidable, would counterattack. Fresh troops in white camouflage uniforms, equipped with weapons designed for winter warfare, would strike the overextended German flanks. Soviet ski battalions would infiltrate behind German lines. T-34 tanks with wide tracks that distributed weight effectively in snow would maul German panzers immobilized by cold. Moscow would hold, damaged, burned, shelled, but unconquered. Stalin would remain in the Kremlin, personally directing the defense. The psychological impact would be enormous. The Nazi war machine could be stopped, but the strategic situation would remain desperately dangerous for the Soviet Union. Unlike real history, there would be no second front to divide German attention. No Allied invasion of North Africa in 1942, no Italian campaign in 1943, no D-Day in 1944. The Wehrmacht could reorganize, refit, and resume offensive operations with its full strength concentrated against a single enemy. The alternate war between Germany and the Soviet Union would become a titanic struggle of attrition unlike anything in human history. Two totalitarian empires locked in single combat, each dedicated to the other's complete destruction, neither able to achieve decisive victory. German advantages would be significant. The undivided Wehrmacht would field 300 divisions on the Eastern Front by 1942 instead of the historical 200. Industrial production, not supporting campaigns in Africa or Western Europe, would produce more tanks, aircraft, and ammunition for the Eastern Front. The deadly 88mm anti-aircraft guns that defended German cities from Allied bombing would instead serve as devastating anti-tank weapons, destroying Soviet armor at ranges the T-34 couldn't match. But Soviet advantages would prove ultimately decisive. The population of the USSR, 190 million people, would dwarf Germany's 80 million. Soviet industrial production, once reorganized beyond the Urals, would eventually outproduce Germany regardless of German production increases. The T-34 tank and Katyusha rocket launcher would remain superior weapons, and Soviet soldiers, fighting for their homeland against genocidal invaders, would demonstrate the same desperate courage that characterized their resistance in actual history. The war would drag into 1943, 1944, perhaps 1945. German offensives would advance hundreds of miles only to be ground down by Soviet counterattacks. The oil fields of the Caucasus would change hands multiple times. Cities like Stalingrad and Kursk would become symbols of resistance and sacrifice, just as they did historically. But slowly, inexorably, the industrial and demographic superiority of the Soviet Union would assert itself. By 1944, the Red Army would begin pushing westward. Not as quickly as in real history, where German forces were spread thin across multiple fronts, but moving nonetheless. Soviet armies would recapture Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. They would cross into Poland. By 1945, Soviet forces would reach the German border and begin the invasion of the Reich itself. But this invasion would be bloodier and more prolonged than the historical one. Every German division would be defending the homeland rather than scattered across Europe. Berlin would face a siege even more terrible than the actual Battle of Berlin. The war might not end until 1946, but it would end the same way, with Soviet flags flying over the Reichstag, with Germany in ruins, and with the Nazi regime destroyed. The legacy of this alternate conflict would be profound. A Soviet Union that conquered Germany largely through its own efforts would dominate Central Europe completely. The Cold War that followed would be even more dangerous, with Soviet power extending further west and Soviet confidence bolstered by sole victory over Nazism. The human cost, perhaps 50 million dead in this single conflict, would make it the bloodiest war in human history by far. The devastation would scar both nations for generations. The actual history of World War II, where Germany fought multiple enemies across multiple fronts, resulted in catastrophic losses, but also in a more distributed conflict that ultimately shortened the war and reduced casualties compared to this alternate scenario. The lesson remains clear. In warfare, concentration of force creates short-term advantages, but strategic overextension creates long-term vulnerabilities. Germany's actual multi-front war doomed it, but a single-front war might have doomed even more people to death and suffering before reaching the same inevitable conclusion: the defeat of Nazi Germany. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to the Empire Lab as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.